This podcast is brought to you by...
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast, and I'm here today with a returning guest. It's been a while. A lot has happened. I have been told that I am an old timer on Substack by other Substackers. So since the fall of 2020, I think I talked to Leighton in 2021. So Leighton Woodhouse is on the show. He has his own Substack, the social studies Substack, but I think it's leightonwoodhouse.substack.com. Yep. So that's the URL. Leighton has a background, just for those of you who don't know, I did graduate work in sociology at Berkeley, and so obviously kind of makes sense in terms of the title of his Substack. He's been a filmmaker, I believe, freelance journalist, worked with the Intercept, other places. And now, besides the Substack, he is contributing to the Free Press and elsewhere. And so I want to talk about Oakland. I want to talk about, crime, urban decay or lack thereof, public disorder. And I want to talk to Leighton because I know, I sometimes hang out with Leighton when I go to the Bay Area, and we've just talked about the juxtaposition between the way, kind of like what nature gifted the Bay Area, and then what is done with it in a way recently. And it wasn't always like that. I lived in Berkeley for a while, and that was around, let's say plus or minus 2 years, 2010. That was kind of a different regime in many ways in urban America. So just for the non-Americans, actually, let me I'm gonna open it up. I want to give people a sense of Oakland. So Oakland is across the bay from SF, so it's not that far away. And there are people that work in SF who live in Oakland and vice versa. So it's
including,
they're basically part of,
including the drug dealers in the Tenderloin, by the way.
That's fair, okay, but it's basically part of the greater San Francisco area, the Bay Area. It's one of the bigger cities actually, so it's not like a small suburb or anything like that. It has its own kind of political and social environment. I think arguably it's more left than San Francisco, which has had more corporate stuff in the city that kind of balances it out despite its countercultural sensibility. So I want to give a sense of the climate though. It's just like perfect weather. So it's a little warmer and not as foggy as SF, right? And its average temperature in January is about 60 degrees. Which is 15 Celsius. And its average temperature in July is 72 degrees, which is about 22 Celsius. 22 inches of rain a year, mostly in 4 winter months. So just really beautiful environment. When I am meeting up with Leighton, a lot of times we're sitting on an outdoor patio or something, and it's totally natural. It's not sticky, it's dry, but it also has the moderation of maritime, just like the marine influence of the ocean and the bay, Mediterranean climate. There's a lot of reasons you want to live there. On the other hand, Oakland, for a period in the 70s and 80s was known for its crime, and it was a pretty scary place. I think there was a period where it was the murder capital of America. Now that's bounced between various, it's not like a 10-year stretch, like right. East St. Louis, Oakland, it bounced around. But it's also seen some demographic change recently. It was a very, very black city for a while between, say, 1970 and maybe, say, 2000. So the year 2000, 35% African American. Today in the 2020 census, so not even today, today's 2024, it was 20% African American. And a lot of that change, some of it is actually increased white proportion from 24% to 27%. And then Asian has been about the same, 16, 15%. And then a lot more Latinos and some more multiracial people, which you would be in that.
California-wide story about black population going down and Latino.
Yeah. If you look at, if I read off the stats for Compton, it would be crazy. Yeah. Because the cultural production of Compton still, I think people still have NWA, and that group and gangster rap. But Compton's mostly a Latino area now, even though they're, candidly, maybe it's different in the Spanish language media, but they're totally culturally a zero. The dominant demographic in large parts of California is very culturally not influential. This is not the topic of the podcast. I will say though, and I've said this before, and I have friends in California who've come to Texas and they've noticed the same thing. So you have a situation where in California, the Latinos are very segregated from the Asians and the whites. You
Mhm.
come to Texas, there's still a lot of segregation, but I have Latino friends here. I have Hispanic friends, call it Hispanic here, And partly I think it's just like cheaper and there's more residential integration. And then you go to Miami and then it's like they're like, why aren't you speaking Spanish? Because
Right.
they're
But
your doctors.
there's a huge difference in California and Texas because in Texas you have all these Tejanos, right? These Hispanics, and I say Hispanics instead of Latino because they call themselves Hispanics because they don't call themselves Latino, who have
Yeah,
been there for hundreds of years when Texas was Mexico. The border, they didn't cross the border crossed them, those folks. And then in
yeah,
California, it's immigrants. So there's a segregated, like, it's not really a racial segregation so much as it's like immigrant enclaves segregating themselves.
sure.
Not the case in Texas.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, you go to San Antonio, it's not. I mean, there's a lot of those people that the Tejanos that you're talking about. Second, third, fourth, and of course, you're saying like people that were just always there. From the annexation of the 1840s. So it's a different culture there. But I want to talk to you about Oakland, partly because the crime issue is very salient to a lot of us who don't live there. I mean, I follow your work, so partly I know it because of you, but also, I had a friend. I'll tell you guys a story. Like, I had a friend, and she she had a kid, in the backseat of a rented SUV. She's from SoCal, but she was in the Bay Area for work, and she decided to take her family, and she was at a gas station in Oakland, and she was basically like held up, you know. And so, there was a kid in the back. Like, it was very disturbing for her, and she went to like leave a Yelp review because the employee seemed very sanguine about it when she reported. She like went in, she was like, they just, I just got robbed, and there was like a bunch of reports on the
Mhm.
Yelp review of people getting robbed,
Yeah.
and she's like, how is this gas station still around? Like,
Well, I'm sorry, which gas station was it?
I don't know which. I can look it up, but
Do you know if it was by the airport?
I think it was.
Yeah, so that whole stretch by the airport is like there's an In-N-Out that is recently closed down. In-N-Out has never closed a restaurant before, but they closed this one, which was profitable. The gas stations, everything around the airport is just constantly jacked because they're getting tourists who stop by with their rental car to pick up a burger, so they don't have to pay airport prices for lunch. Go fill up the tank before dropping it off. All those are opportunities for somebody to smash the window and pull the luggage out.
Yeah, there was weird stuff. Yeah, it was at the airport. Now that I recall, because like she had just landed and got the rental car. But this is like third world experience. This should not be happening in an American city around an airport, right?
Yes.
As,
Um,
so why don't you talk about? You've reported like some of the stuff is freaky, frankly, that you reported about, and like I've been to Oakland, I've had lunch with you there. There's areas that are fine, so I don't want to
yeah.
paint with too broad of a brush, but there's like pockets of seriously scary behavior. So talk about that.
So the third world comparison is interesting. I've never lived in a third world country. I might have visited third world countries. I've never lived in one. So I can't say, so like, I can't make that. I don't know if that comparison is accurate or not. And it might, if the case is that living in like a poor city in the third world is one in which there's just rampant crime everywhere that you're seeing constantly, then it's not comparable to a third world city. But I think it's probably more likely the case that in a poor city in a third world country, say like El Salvador, you probably aren't going to see crimes every day, but it's happening around you, and you're aware of it. It's in the
They
ambient.
would they would target outsiders is the issue. It's like if you go to some of these countries, they're not very dangerous countries for the people there, but then they see an outsider that they think has a lot of money.
Right. So
You
right.
better have someone taking care of you.
Yeah, so if that is the experience of living in a third world country, then it is very comparable. I mean, even to the point where, like, in Colombia, they used to, back in the day when Colombia was the crime capital of the world, people would like box you in on the roads and then jack you up in your car, and like that, there was like a viral video which I'm sure some people listening to this have seen before in Oakland, up in this up on Skyline Boulevard, which is a nice street right by these regional parks where people go hiking and walk their dogs. And there's a video on a dash cam of a woman who's like, the car in front of her peels out and blocks her on the roadway, and the guy runs out with a gun trying to rob her car, trying to rob her, and then she like pulls out around the, like on the sidewalk and around him and gets away. But like it's like in the middle of broad daylight on a night street, guy just pulling the car over, running out with his gun to jack her up. That feels like some like Bogota kind of scenario. So that stuff is around in Oakland. It's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, and like let me just like paint a picture. Like I have another friend. He's anyway, professor UC Berkeley. Okay, I forget where it is, but he's got like I think it's that area that you're talking about. Like up, we have like a beautiful view of the whole bay, up in the hills, and down at the bottom of like where he lived, which is like multi-million-dollar homes. There was like some major like the major crimes were happening, and so he was like they're thinking about moving. I think because it's like spreading into areas where well-off people are.
Yeah.
And once that happens,
Yeah. Yeah. There used to be this phrase called, crime don't climb. It's just not the case anymore. The hills. I mean, I think I don't live in the hills. I live in the flat area of Oakland, which is traditionally more dangerous. I actually think at this point the hills might be sketchier. Like not insofar as like there's like there's side shows and there's all the kind of regular disorder happening around you in the flat area. But I think I'm probably less likely to be home invaded, for example, than if I lived in the hills, because there are folks are that like it's a job. The criminals go up into the hills where they know that people are not home and they have lots of stuff. And they target, like there was a story about specifically Chinese families being targeted in the hills by a particular robbery crew. So the hills have become a target in a way they weren't before.
yeah, talk about the political. I mean, you guys got a mayor, you have a district attorney. Like, what's going on here? Why do they feel like they can engage in these home invasions? I mean, it seems like crime is just I just read random things where basically, I mean, what was it? The other thing is that homeless people are stripping metal from the street lights, so they're replacing it with stop signs.
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's very third world, dude. That's like legit. Like, come on, man.
And that's so there's two intersecting crises in Oakland that I think it's worthwhile teasing apart. There is the sort of regular crime, just property crime, which is usually carried out by like young men, right? Like teenagers who are, basically career criminals, whether they're doing so for economic gain or for thrills. And I think actually a lot more of it is for thrills really than for profits. So there's that happening, which is a familiar story. And then the other one, also a familiar story at this point, is the street addiction crisis. So like somebody who's like stealing copper wiring is probably an addict. Although I could be wrong about that. Maybe there's a market now for professional criminals to go out and do that. But the crackhead stuff, now more fentanyl head stuff or meth head stuff, is also happening. And although that's much more visible and prevalent in San Francisco, but it's in Oakland too.
Yeah. So, tell me about your mayor. Tell me about your district attorney and how they're reacting to this.
So the mayor is a woman named Sheng Tao. She's, I think she's like in her 30s. She's totally, in my opinion, totally incompetent, completely out of her league. She's just like, she's just I think she's a deer caught in the headlights. She was very ideological. She was very vociferously in favor of like defunding the police back in 2020. But she's a politician. She's was more or less on the defund the police bandwagon because that was the fad at the time. I don't think it came from any heartfelt place, because then when she ran for mayor, of course, she ran on a public safety platform because all of a sudden people were concerned about crime. A couple of years later, when crime surged, in part because of defunding the police. So that's her. And then the DA, more interesting case actually, is Pamela Price, who is a Chesa Boudin replica, except more so. She's extremely progressive. She has never been a prosecutor before she was DA. She's like a civil rights attorney. And she has a very unapologetic decarceral agenda. And so ironically, what's happened is that, Chesa Boudin was recalled in San Francisco, and a bunch of his staff who were fired from the office when he was recalled came across the bay and started working for Pamela Price. And then a bunch of the people who were with the DA, which was a more traditional, progressive, but more traditional DA, was the who preceded Pamela Price. A lot of those folks, Pamela Price purged, and they went across the bay, and now they're working for Brooke Jenkins, the DA of San Francisco, who's a more traditional DA. So there's been this kind of switcheroo across the bay, and now we have and so now we're going through our Chesa Boudin phase.
So, I guess I don't understand, so there's this whole thing about Soros, DAs. Is she one of those people?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So it's like her, Gascon or whatever in LA, Chesa Boudin. There's a guy in Philly.
Drag in New York. Mm-hmm.
Look, we both come from science backgrounds, social science, you, me, natural science. You do experiments, you run the experiment. Everything does she think that there's a conspiracy theory that's manufacturing disinformation about the crime? Because everything that I've seen reported seems quite just immune to updating her worldview.
Yeah. She's a woman with a mission. There's like almost a part of me that grudgingly respects her commitment to the part, because because she's like, there's Sheng Tao, the mayor, who was like on the defund train until that became uncool. And then all of a sudden she's on public safety. Like, in a way, I respect Pamela Price more that like even now that the chips are down and she's facing a recall election and she's historically unpopular, she's still like 1000% sticking with the script of, in mass incarceration is a product of structural racism, period. No other factor involved. Everybody who's arrested and convicted is somehow a victim. Their actual crime victims are somehow not. This sort of upside down world. She's very committed to that, and she's an ideological activist in that respect. She's not a DA. She's not a politician. She's an activist. Chesa Boudin was very much the same way. So she's not going to be swayed from that ideology by mere evidence or factual reality.
Let me ask you something. So Pamela Price is 67. I'm just like double checked it, looked it up. She went to Yale. She went to I think it was called Bolt then, but the Cal Law School, yeah. Berkeley. Okay, so pretty good pedigree. She's been around. I'm looking at the demographics. There are there's probably like 50% more like non-Hispanic, white people in Oakland now than black people, who are probably less than 20% in 2024. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of Latinos now, probably more than 30%. You have a situation in Southern California, in LA, where blacks tend to be overrepresented in the political arena, partly just because of historical. They've been a major part of the Democratic apparatus and machine there. Oakland, when I was growing up, when we were growing up, Oakland was definitely a chocolate city. Yeah. It was its identity, was as a black city. There was like a rap scene, there was an R&B scene, and now it's not. It's not a black city anymore. But Pamela Price is, she's African American, and so I just wonder if what we're seeing here is kind of a cultural lag, where the new people in Oak, because they have to be new people. They came in, they're not politically active, they're not politically aware. They're not part of the apparatus. Like, are we just seeing the demographics change in a city underneath, their feet? I don't know.
Well, so obviously there's been a decline in the black population in Oakland. I would say that it still very much feels like a chocolate city in a lot of Oakland. East Oakland, particularly deep East Oakland, although that's becoming increasingly Latino as well. But and West Oakland, it's a pretty black city. It's also, like most of America, a racially segregated city. So it's like you go to these particular neighborhoods tend to be in the flat areas. And it feels much more like the Oakland that you would imagine the Black Panthers coming up in. Then there's the hills, and there's Temescal and Rockridge, and those areas that are more sort of Berkeley adjacent. And those tend to be, just a totally different world, right? Totally different environment. Bougie. This is nothing unique to Oakland. This is like every city, right? You go neighborhood to neighborhood, and it's just you're in a totally different social universe. Bougie restaurants and parents pushing strollers and whatnot. A really ideal kind of residential area, mixed commercial residential areas. really beautiful parts of Oakland. So those are two different worlds. A lot of this is also not really a revelation. This has happened elsewhere as well. But, a lot of the really liberal policies in Oakland around crime and disorder have come from their base has been more in those affluent white areas. And like the two, there's I think three members, there's three black members of the city council. The two members who were, so one of them was from West Oakland, which is dangerous. But she's super woke. And then there's East Oakland and Deep East Oakland. And the prior city council member for my area of Oakland, which has high crime rate, but not as bad as east of this district, voted against defunding the police. And that city councilman voted against defunding the police. And his colleague to the east, which was the second of three black members of the city council, also voted against defunding the police for the obvious reason that they were representing voters who were disproportionately the victims of crime and experienced the downside of general social disorder. And those voters did not want to have the Oakland Police Department, which is radically understaffed, even further gutted. Whereas people in Rockridge and Temescal were much more favorable to that ideology and have a big buyer's remorse now because now it's happening to them.
Yeah, that's it. Because it's it's a social science experiment, but they assumed that the experiment would be done on other people.
Yeah.
So it's we could just try it out, but they thought their lives were going to continue as they always continue, that they were going to be insulated, and they're not. I mean, this is why we're talking about it, honestly, because candidly, crime happens in poor neighborhoods in the U.S., in the ghetto. It's been happening, and that's not news. What's news is the home invasions. What's news is, well-off, comfortable, upper middle class people feeling scared.
Yes. And that's where the third world comparison also comes in more. Like it feels, you hear about like rich people in Bogota or something like that, or in San Salvador or whatever. There's not that many rich people in San Salvador, but there's at least middle class people, and there's certainly rich people in Bogota. But these cities where if you have any money, you live behind in a gated compound with armed security at the front, and when you leave with a security detail, because you could get kidnapped on the road. That's not the case in Oakland. Nobody's getting kidnapped, and people don't have armed security. But it is comparable insofar as it's like you could see that being the case in 10 years. If things continued on this trajectory, because you don't have that isolated, you don't have that insulated middle class and upper middle class anymore. You've got crime going everywhere, which is, I think, similar to at least my perception of the way a city like Bogota would be, for example.
Yeah, it's okay. One thing, people of our generation, we saw the tail end of white flight and basically kind of the decline of the city in American life. And then the generation that came after us, millennials, saw the reverse.
Right.
And I think basically a lot of this defund the police, all this activism, my perception, you can whatever, give your opinion on it. I think a lot of it is actually driven by the fact that a lot of millennials do not remember the 70s and 80s crime waves, and they why not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's there were 20 years of peace, essentially, of where it seemed like the main role of the police was hassling poor people and not actually stopping crime. I think I hadn't thought about it that way, but it's an excellent point. I mean, there's like a sort of a collective hallucination that we don't need police anymore.
Well, I mean, did you ever go to New York City in the 80s?
No, but 90s, yes.
Yeah, because up until even the early 90s, it was the same. The amount of situational awareness that outsiders often had in the more touristy public areas of the city was totally night and day compared to, say, the Bloomberg regime.
Yeah,
I mean, the Bloomberg regime was professional managerial class paradise.
I lived in New York for a couple of years in the late 90s under Giuliani, which was the transition point. And I was robbed twice while I lived in New York for just a couple of years. And it wasn't like traumatizing. It was just like, that's just life in New
That's just
York.
what happens. It's like as Seth Rogen would say, that's just life in a city.
Exactly. Now I would be more livid about it, but back then, when you're like in your 20s, you're like, whatever, just poor people's tax or whatever. But yeah, it was very much more normalized. And of course, Giuliani was this was during the period when Giuliani was um, just flooding Manhattan with cops. I mean, it was insane how many cops there were. It was just like, it felt like you lived like in an occupied city. There were so many cops. Got rid of the squeegee guys, all of this kind of like broken windows policing kind of stuff, of taking care of like minor quality of life disorders in order to have that trickle up into, and I'm on the fence as to whether that worked or not. I was in New York during that time. I've kind of studied since. I'm now seeing the return of just like low level social disorder in the Bay Area, where everybody's hopping the turnstiles to get on BART. And intuitively, yeah, it makes the broken windows thing make sense. If you normalize hopping the turnstiles, if you normalize just like, sideshows, which is, for those who don't know, that's intersection takeovers where people just do donuts in the middle of the intersection, constantly happening in Oakland, then it starts to just break down sort of prohibitions on other things, more serious things. You're like, well, if you can just take over an intersection, start doing donuts in the middle of it, and hold up traffic for half an hour, versus going and bipping a car, which is smashing its window and pulling out the property, versus jacking a car, versus a home invasion. You can see how these things start to feel like just gradations rather than any sort of like qualitative difference between one category and the other. And when you start to normalize one, you just sort of ascend that ladder. That makes sense to me intuitively. And I do feel like that's happening in the Bay Area. That said, I'm not sure if the Giuliani strategy was really what led to New York's change. Obviously, a change did follow, but it also followed in a lot of cities that didn't adopt those policies. But you can it does feel like a kind of a return. Like Oakland feels like almost the flip side of when I was in New York and things were getting quote unquote better, and
Yeah.
worse in some respects, like in terms of police. There was awful NYPD police brutality at the time, but now it feels like the descending version of that, where we're starting to see more and more disorder and more
Yeah.
tolerance for disorder.
Yeah, I've been in New York recently. I wouldn't. It's not like the '80s or early '90s yet, but it's definitely different. It's a different vibe than the Julie. Well, actually, I wasn't there too much during the Giuliani phase. I went a lot during the Bloomberg era.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a different vibe. And so you definitely see it when you go to SF. I go to San Francisco, and people rightly point out the murder rate isn't that high. You're not going to get shot up, but everyone has a very, very conscious situational awareness of the probability of theft. So here in Austin, I'll leave stuff out in coffee shops in a way that I would never think about doing it in SF.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You wouldn't even in Oakland or San Francisco. You have to think twice about just going out to eat, because your car window might be smashed when you get back to your car. There's a certain the Bay Area is different from East Coast cities, and actually West Coast cities are different from East Coast cities insofar as we're broken up into a bunch of municipalities here that on the East Coast would have been one big city. So there's sort of a category error that people have when they think of, well, San Francisco, there's this kind of crime that's high and this kind of crime that's low. Like there's not much violent crime, but there's open drug dealing and open drug use. Well, that's kind of normal for a metropolitan area, right? Like in the 80s in New York, there was violence everywhere. But like in the 90s and going into the 2000s, you would find violent crime mostly in the outer boroughs and like way uptown Manhattan. But like Manhattan, for the most part, was like, it wasn't unsafe. And then eventually the whole city was very safe. And now we're going back to lots of crime in the outer boroughs, but Manhattan probably relatively normal. So you have to think of San Francisco as sort of just like downtown Bay Area, essentially, where they have the financial district. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but it's like, yeah, it to me, it's understandable that you're going to have a certain type of crime in your city center and a different kind of crime in the outlying, working class concentric circles around it.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. It's like all basically like a huge urban area is disaggregated, and we analyze it, you know, a la carte kind of. I mean, if you're in Palo Alto, okay, here's a. I don't know if I've ever told this story. This story from 20 years ago. A luxury car company was trying to do like, got market research on like how much security they needed. This was from 20 years ago, and basically, it was like a convertible. So they decided to do two extreme cases, Gary, Indiana, and Palo Alto.
Uh-huh.
And they had a camera videotaping what happened, and they left like the top of the convertible open in Gary and Palo Alto. And in Gary, Indiana, um, everything was stripped
Hmm.
within 24 hours. Like, they showed like a guy in a truck. He came by and he looked around. And he came back with his family, and they just kind of, and all sorts of, the description was basically like the natural resource out there, and it was stripped like
Right.
vultures stripping
Right.
a carcass. In Palo Alto, they had to like end the experiment because after a week, the only contact with someone else was like, it was unseasonably sprinkling, and so a guy like pulled the top and covered it up, and they kept going.
That's, um,
It just shows you the wide variance in this diverse country, you know?
Yeah. Well, in Oakland, it's much more like Gary insofar as like I see. So there's like a normal site in Oakland is seeing like, so, people get steal cars, jack cars all the time, usually often Kias because they're so easy to steal. And then they joyride them and then they'll sell them for like, $100 to somebody else who uses it as a getaway car in a one-time robbery or something. So, but a lot of times they'll also just abandon them, right? They'll steal a car, do some sideshows in them and just abandon it on the side of the road. You'll see these abandoned cars. And first of all, in Oakland, it'll take like sometimes like a week for them to even get towed, even though they're in the middle of a street of a major intersection or artery, not intersection, it would be towed sooner than that, but like, a fairly major street. And then over time, as you're driving by it each day, you just see this steady decay, right? You just see like, now the rims are gone and now like it's been stripped and then the next day it's been tagged and there's a bunch of graffiti on it and then the day after that it's been torched and it's just like and it feels kind of like this actually happened at I think it was a Denny's near the airport again that closed and it was like kind of similar where you see before where it just looks like a Denny's and then after where the whole thing is like bombed out, everything's stripped and it's like graffiti everywhere and the image feels like, and with these cars it feels the same, it feels like those images of like what there was this book called I forget what it's called, but it was basically about like what would happen if humans disappeared off the face of the earth. Like,
Oh, yeah, I remember that book. Yeah.
yeah, it's like 5 years, 10 years, 1,000 years, like, and it's like nature just creeping back and kind of taking over. That's what it looks like. It looks like you abandon a car and then all of a sudden like this urban nature jungle kind of creeps up and strips
Yeah.
it, tags it, torches it. Eventually it's just this husk of a car and then it's towed. It's like
Well, let
what
me,
ecosystem of Oakland.
I want to ask you about like what's going to happen in the future, but before that, let me just give some context for the listener. How important where you live, like your greater urban area, is in this country. So we talk about America, produces all this innovation and all this stuff. Really, that's not true. It's not America. There's no fucking innovation going on in Wyoming. Frankly, there's no fucking innovation going on in most of Illinois. No offense to Chicago.
Mhm.
It's really the Bay Area is really just the 700-pound gorilla or whatever that is driving America in a lot of ways. Yeah, like Elon moved. There's a gigafactory here in Texas, and he wants to shift over. But where did he really start out? He started out in the Bay Area because that's where you have the smartest, most entrepreneurial people in the country. In terms of venture capital investment, it's the San Francisco is like hundreds of millions. No, it's billions ahead of New York, the greater New York area, which is number two, right? Like the Bay Area is like I'm just looking at the numbers. It's like 4 times as much investment in venture capital as New York City, right? At the greater New York area, and you're saying wow, partly because like the Bay Area is much smaller.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
so on a per capita basis, it's like incredible. It's let's see, it looks like it's about like 20 times more than Austin area.
Does
Okay,
it break down how much of it is AI?
no, but this is from 2020. This is Bloomberg 2023, so this would be pre AI bubble. So
Right.
this is even before the AI stuff. So the AI bubble, by the way, just so listeners know, I mean, I think some of them I mentioned this. There are people who are leaving Austin, going back to mostly Hayes Valley to work at AI startups. It's just you have to go there. That's where the smartest people are. It's where you can like hire people. A lot of this is not even due to money. A lot of this is due to the fact that just like there's these group homes where 25-year-old nerds live, and they're the smartest kids from MIT, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, etc. And they just like they live there, and they're willing to experience. Well, I mean, they obviously like they'll live in a closet that's $2,000 a month. Like literally, it could be a closet, in a
Right.
bigger house. Like this is the life. I mean, I don't want to go into like the housing issue, which like okay, like that will just like take us way off the rails, and we both every American now has very strong opinions about this, but you guys are like ground zero for that. But this is a very important part of America to function correctly. Now, in some ways, I think because it's very wealthy, in particular San Francisco, they have like all of these taxes from these corporations. It subsidizes their quote experiments, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Um, but how much, there was a period where Austin was getting a lot of people that were just like over it. They were over the crime. They were over being robbed. They were over like the property crime, the prices, everything. And what I've seen is actually people that are at a certain level of maturity in their career, and maybe they don't want to be entrepreneurs anymore. They'll exit. They come to Austin, which that's great. I would say like unfortunately like we just don't have like the young super hungry people to the same degree as the Bay Area because location matters so much, and it's like a winner take all Matthew effect going on.
Yeah. That was probably around the time that Austin banned outdoor camping, right?
Yeah.
Not coincidentally, because all these people are coming out from California. They're like, this is exactly why we moved here.
Well, okay. Before I let you talk, and I will let you talk, but I want to say one thing because I don't know if anyone's like talked about this in detail. One of the things that people often say when you move to Austin, it's a very liberal city. The precinct that I live in is actually more voted for Democrats more than the one that I lived in when I was in graduate school at Davis. So it's like 87%, whatever. The city itself, Austin, the county, Travis County, is as liberal. It's a little bit more liberal than Los Angeles County. Okay. Like more than 70% voted for Biden, that sort of thing. Okay. It's a pretty liberal area. But everyone who moves here knows that they're moving into a very conservative state, or moderately conservative, I'd say. And the legislature meets in Austin. So what you often have is kind of a dialectical like synthesis between the city leadership that often wants to be super liberal to be popular, kind of, but they also are not stupid, and they know that the legislature is probably just going to veto them and overrule them. That's what they do. And so like some of this stuff with like the housing and the homelessness, that is due to outside, because the legislators are meeting in Austin. Like these encampments were very close to where the Capitol is.
Yeah.
So people from like rural conservative areas show up and they're like, what's going on here? They're going to act. I feel like in California, you have an issue where it's a one party state now.
I mean, have you been to Sacramento recently?
Not in a while. Why?
The homelessness problem in Sacramento, I think, is if anything worse than San Francisco, and it's right next to the Capitol. It's like all downtown feels like the people walking around are either just government workers who are just going to grab a bite to eat, or they're meth addicts. It's like those are the worlds downtown, and the latter vastly outnumbers the former.
I just think that part of it is like California has a democratic one party system, and I don't think. I mean, Newsom's obviously not as liberal as the mayors of these cities, but there's only so much he's going to do against his own people.
I mean, I think that there's both. Like Newsom has been very aggressive on this. He deserves every ounce of criticism about the fact that he's been promising to end homelessness for 20 years and it's only gotten worse. But that said, he has been, quite aggressive on the issue. There are stumbling blocks in California which are outside of the purview of voters and legislators. Like, I think if legislators reflected the true will of California, a lot more would be done. And to a certain extent, they do reflect the will of their constituencies. But like, for example, in San Francisco, you have judges who are holding up any progress. So you've got, voters who are voting in representatives who are very liberal, but who are addressing their issues, who are trying to pass resolutions, pass laws in order to address things like street camping and open drug use and crime in the city. You've got a DA now who's more traditional, who's totally willing to lock up drug dealers. You've got a mayor who's on the same page. Everybody's on the same page, except for sort of the nonprofit activist class who have this outsized power in a city like San Francisco. To your point, because of how rich San Francisco is, it's got this massive budget to contract out city services to this huge strata of nonprofits, and then with those city contracts, with that wealth, those nonprofits have become very politically influential, and they've become their own lobby, sort of like deep state style. But then you have these judges who are like, San Francisco wasn't even able to sweep homeless encampments for like the better part of a year because of a single federal magistrate who didn't even live in San Francisco, who ruled that the city wasn't allowed to until they built enough well, I won't get into when you go on Twitter and you complain about crime in the Bay Area, there's this sort of right-wing reflex of people go, they voted for this, you voted for this, like blaming. So to a certain extent, that's true. Like Oakland voters voted for Pamela Price to be the district attorney. Yeah. To another extent, it's totally not true and totally unjustifiable. Like, the representatives in San Francisco who are actually voted in are mostly aligned, at least when you're talking about the DA and the mayor, and probably half of the board of supervisors are aligned on doing something about these issues. But the judges who are either not voted in or they're voted in those elections, which are a joke, right? Because there's like two judges or often one, and then you've never heard of them before, and you check a box. It's total like mockery of democracy. So they're basically unelected. Those folks are making the decisions. So then you have a situation like in San Francisco where the city is prevented from being able to sweep homeless encampments for a year, even though that's what was the will of the clear majority of voters. So I think there's a level of analysis of the way in which urban power works in an urban environment that has to be dissected before people take this knee jerk sort of blame the victim attitude of like, well, this is what happens because when you have a bunch of Democrats, it's like, well, no, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a whole separate thing, the rule by judges, which is, it's happening in a lot of America. But why is it so much of a problem, it seems, on the West Coast? Is it just like the personnel that was in the pipeline in these Western, more liberal districts? Because it doesn't seem like it's happening on the East Coast.
I mean, it's a good question. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has obviously historically been the most progressive and left leaning district in America, and then also at the municipal level. I mean, you've got it's probably just progressive politicians who then appoint progressive judges, and then progressive lawyers who run for office. I don't really have a good explanation for that, but I will say that like the tendency in a courtroom in San Francisco, like if you're a drug dealer and you're from Honduras, all the professional drug dealers are all from actually one town in Honduras. They're not here legally, and you're selling fentanyl and meth on the street. There's this like set of lines that you go through if you are on the rare occasion that you're actually arrested and you actually go in front of a judge, then you go, oh, I'm an addict myself and I'm just supporting drugs to support my habit. And also I live in a tent on the sidewalk in the Tenderloin. None of this is true. They actually live in apartment buildings in Oakland. As I was saying earlier, they commute across the bay to go sell in San Francisco. They are not drug addicts. It's very much frowned upon to touch your own supply. If you do, you might get cut off from your supplier, which tend to be the Sinaloa drug cartel. They are professional drug dealers who are here for a few years to make a bunch of money and then move back home. They're building mansions back home in this village. There's pictures of these mansions in the San Francisco Chronicle. But all these lies serve to like basically, then a judge is like, oh, you can't help yourself, you're an addict, you're just struggling with your addiction. And the reason why they say that they're homeless in San Francisco, other than currying sympathy, is also to say you can't, if you ban me from the Tenderloin, if you just do a stay away order, I won't be able to access crucial services that I need as a San Franciscan, which are available only to San Franciscans, not to people from Oakland, and that are clustered in the Tenderloin. So you can't keep me out of the area where I deal drugs from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. every day, or else you'll be harming me as a victim of drug addiction and poverty. Just transparent lies. I need to do some more reporting on this to understand how judges can be so stupid. But what I've heard from numerous attorneys is that the judges just take this at face value. They just go, okay, no stay away orders, diversion to some substance abuse program that they never show up to, and then they're back on the street selling the next day.
It's interesting to me that you're talking about people blaming the voters, and I've seen that actually. Actually, I retweeted some city council meeting where people were just like, I mean, they were going crazy, man. But people were just like, I don't care. They're like libs in Oakland and all that. I'm from Oregon, and basically decriminalized drugs. And now they're recriminalizing a lot of stuff because the voters, they saw what happened. Yeah. And they just were like, no. And the legislature acted. And Oregon is a very direct democracy. California is too, but Oregon is crazy in terms of how many ballot measures are. It's good and bad. I think the good thing is, people in Oregon, what happens at the, at the level of the population itself is reflected in the legislature and the governance. Now, sometimes that can lead to weird areas, So, for example, a lot of people think Oregon is like super liberal, but George W. Bush almost won the state in the year 2000. Like a lot of the shift has been very recent. People from California and out of state coming into Portland, and even then it's still like 40% Trump supporting. So there's large areas.
And Christine Drazan, is that her name? The Republican nominee who came pretty close to winning
she came pretty. It was when I was growing up, it was actually I would say it was a moderate Republican state. With Hatfield and Packwood and those people, liberal Republican with Tom McCall in the 70s. But in any case, it was not, what it is today or what's perceived today. A lot of that is just Portland. But even in Portland, they just got a new DA who is going to bring back law and order, So, I mean, some people might say liberals are crazy, and maybe they are crazy, but they're not that crazy.
Yeah. Well, there's also this is the only podcast where I would venture to get this nerdy about the cultural origins of this. But you and I think, have discussed before David Hackett Fisher's book, Album with Seed, which for listeners is about the sort of various waves of migration from different parts of England to colonial America and how they created these radically different cultures in different regions of the East Coast. There's another book I recently read by Colin Woodard, which is sort of a nice companion piece called The Nations of America, I think, and kind of expands on Fisher's thesis. And there's a hell of a lot to it. And one thing he points out, so there's like one of the nations is the left coast, which is not the West Coast, but just the very much the coastal like little ribbon along the West Coast, and then points out that east of that ribbon, is the far West. So the far West includes the interior Oregon, interior Washington, and interior California, which have a lot more to do with, have a lot more in common with Utah and Idaho and Wyoming than they do with San Francisco and LA and Seattle. But there's this fusion here. I've been looking for a really good book on San Francisco history, and it is shocking how I couldn't find literally a single book that seemed like worth reading on the history of San Francisco, one of the most important cities in the world right now. So maybe I'll have to write this book someday. But
your project.
Yeah, but the first 4 mayors of San Francisco were Appalachians, and there was and during the gold rush, of course, people were coming from all over the world, but a lot of them from the South, a lot of Appalachians. And so if you know from David Hackett Fisher's book, like Appalachians are, this is where like the don't tread on me kind of libertarian anti-government mindset is very much from Appalachians who came from the borderlands of Ireland and Scotland and England, where they lived under essentially perpetual civil war for like 500 years, where like they're just invading the crown, coming and invading them. just this insane battle zone. That's the settlers to the Appalachians came from that part of England. Well, the Appalachians are also a big influence in California, and people don't tend to realize that. But the other big influence is the Yankees, which is like the totally the op is the big government mentality comes from the Puritan tradition of like ordered liberty, where they're like the you have rights, but those rights are bestowed to you by the Commonwealth. You don't actually have any rights without the Commonwealth granting you those rights. So it's very top down, but beneficent kind of like big government liberalism basically came from that.
A little bit patronizing.
Oh, totally.
Known to be.
Totally. But so then what you have in California and really along the West Coast is along the left coast in Woodard's language is an amalgam between Yankee tradition and Appalachian tradition. And it's like the worst of both worlds. So like this during COVID, I wrote a piece on this, like the during COVID in San Francisco, you had to carry vaccine passports to get into any bar or restaurant, right? They had like some of the most strict lockdown regulations in terms of your ability to be able to participate in everyday life. At the same time, they were housing homeless people in hotels where they were distributing cigarettes and booze. And I believe, I can't prove this, but I believe that city contractors were also distributing illegal drugs to homeless people in these hotels to prevent them from having to go on the streets and spreading the virus. So it was like a shelter in place thing. It was like, and then of course, as soon as COVID was lifted, now it was like back to like you can camp wherever you want on the streets. You can sell meth and fentanyl on the street. You can smoke fentanyl on the streets in front of a schoolyard. Like, who are we? Who are we to tell you how to live your life? Like, you have the liberty to live whatever life you choose. That's not like a liberal kind of virtue. Like, you don't find that in New England. You don't find that in Massachusetts. You find that in California. And I think it's from that mixture of this Appalachian sort of like live free or die. The government can't tell you anything mixed with this Yankee government can tell you everything and make you do anything. And so you have this, the both fused together.
Okay. I had like this idea, which is kind of related. This is kind of a random tangent, but I'm just telling you, I really like the idea. I'm going to get in trouble from some of the listeners, but I really like the idea of turning England into an American protectorate because they have a lot of gardeners, and I think they would love to have USD in their pockets. Speak English, you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of English speaking guest workers, you know what I'm saying? And then we can like spend the summer in London, like 2 months, just rent some like cottage somewhere. Anyway, so like I had this idea, but then I started thinking, wait a second, what if their like shav, like lower class culture hybridizes with our ghetto culture, and it creates like a monstrous like synthesis that's even scarier. Like they like, they're like always rioting at sporting events, but instead of having knives, they have guns.
It's too late. That already happened because our American sort of working class culture, or I don't know how to say it in a non-pejorative way, but lower than working class, underclass culture, I guess, is totally continuous from this. Is David Hackett Fisher writes about like this vernacular, like I've written about this too, inspired by David Hackett Fisher, but like Black vernacular in the United States is derived straight up from these districts of England where like ain't and I be doing this and that, like this Southern vernacular was that's Old English. I mean, it's like a lot of people right that like Southerners speak like a more proximate language to like Shakespearean English than anybody else in the United States, but a lot of our straight up like quote unquote ghetto vernacular, and this speaks by the way to the just total like snobbish arbitrary class distinctions we make around just arbitrary pieces of grammar. Like the grammar of this vernacular is totally coherent and completely logical. But that's all. It's just non-standardized. But it comes directly from these areas of England. This our heritage is the heritage of primarily lower class England, and then mixed with these snobs who settled Virginia and North Carolina, the Cavalier area.
Yeah. Well, so going back to this like kind of like a liberal / libertarian, because I think that's what you're talking about. Like, New England is not libertarian. West Coast does have a libertarian culture, even if it's Democrat and liberal, right?
yeah, Silicon Valley here. There's some good things that
That's
come out
what
of
I was gonna bring that up. I was gonna bring that up. I'm like, maybe the flip side, because I mean, Boston has some innovation, obviously in pharmaceuticals and biotech, but really, people in Silicon Valley, they do crazy things, and I come out of academia, you come out of academia, and some of the startup people, the things that they think that they're gonna do, people in academia are just like, who the fuck do they think they are? But the reality is, 1 out of 100 times, look at what Elon Musk did with SpaceX, right? Like 20
Yeah,
years ago, people were like, who the fuck does he think he is?
yeah. There's a classic book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture. I think it was written probably 25 years ago or something, but it's about. I wish I could remember the name of the author. He's a Stanford professor. I probably have it over here somewhere, but it's about like the countercultural movement of the 60s and the 70s in the Bay Area. You had all this like a political foment, and then you had all these people who kind of became disillusioned with creating political change, and they just did like the dropout thing and moved to the countryside and created these countercultures. There's nothing more American than that. Like it's like dropping out of the city, going and starting being a yeoman farmer, like raising your crops from your own land, nurturing the family. Like this is all like Jeffersonian kind of stuff that they were doing. So even though it was like considered this like hippie counterculture, it was very much kind of in like that Appalachian kind of libertarian tradition. And so you have that mixed with a highly educated class. That's how you got the computer revolution, right? That's how you got people starting companies in their basements. There's a direct lineage from that counterculture to cyberculture, as the title of the book suggests. It could only have happened here. And now it can happen anywhere. It's like we were the birthplace. Now you can export that culture anywhere in the world. But reason why it happened here.
Yeah, so we're at, I think the podcast has gone in an interesting direction because we're highlighting from the outside. Even a lot of Americans, they think like, oh, like liberal democratic Boston, liberal democratic San Francisco, and that's all true. They're both very liberal. They're both very democratic. But I have friends who, shall we say, went to school in Boston, as they say, and then they go to Silicon Valley, and they do note there is a massive culture. I mean, these are very like Boston, SF, like the Silicon Valley, these scenes, Palo Alto, they're filled with extremely bright people. There are people that move between them, like Zuckerberg obviously went to Harvard, dropped out, everyone watched the movie. Okay, but the thing with Boston and New England, that area, is people know their place. There's people who go to Harvard, there's people who went to Tufts, there's people with masters, with PhDs. It's a hierarchy, and everyone, yeah, they're liberal, but look, at the end of the day, everyone knows that there's a pecking order, and that is how it is. Whereas, there are people in Silicon Valley that dropped out of high school and are really rich. Yeah. And I mean, look, Stanford grads are like really overwhelmingly dominant, and like I'm not going to say school doesn't matter, but you run into a lot of people with non-traditional backgrounds, and that's not that doesn't like necessarily end the conversation. Like they're like, okay, they'll give you the oddballs are part of the landscape, whereas what you're talking about in New England and these East Coast cities, I'm thinking specifically Boston because I think it's analogous in terms of its cognitive output. Those are institutional people, and they go on the conveyor belt from like undergrad at Yale, law school at Harvard, clerkship somewhere, blah blah blah. Then maybe they decide they're gonna go work at McKinsey. Like that's their big, ooh, I'm a nonconformist.
Yeah. It's and we should really expand. It's Yankee territory there, and to bring back to Woodard's book and his thesis, it makes so much sense to me. I read the book and it was like a lot of this was made intuitive sense, and then now it makes kind of an intellectual framework around it. Like, why is it that, like, as you know from Oregon, like Boston and San Francisco, even though they to a Republican might seem like the same city, if you're a liberal, you understand that these are radically different cultures. But San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, basically the same culture.
Yeah. Vancouver, Seattle with a queen.
Yeah, exactly. And I've lived in LA for a long time, and LA is an interesting variation on it because with Woodard's thesis, LA is not part of the left coast; it's part of El Norte, but obviously it's got pieces of both. But it's really kind of doing its own thing, distinctive. But obviously it also has a lot of the same problems as San Francisco in terms of homelessness, in terms of open drug use and stuff. So like it's part of that species, but but somewhat apart from that species. But like
Yeah.
the Vancouver, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco thing, it's like uncanny how identical
Yeah.
it feels political culture in these cities and
Yeah.
how different the East Coast.
Political culture, like even like the aesthetic, I would say. So, the hoodie, a little bit shabby, you know what I'm saying? Like LA has a bit more bling, it has that entertainment. LA has a little bit of, I mean, I call Miami the East Coast LA. And
Mm.
that's kind of not fair to LA probably, but you know what I'm getting at. Like people there are very pretty and they're put together, whereas
That's
people in what?
that's the West Side. I mean, there's plenty of beautiful people on the East Side in LA. Don't get me wrong. Like, and in a lot of East Side,
I'm talking Santa Monica. Yeah. Santa Monica
like,
and stuff.
like you go to the East Side where Silver Lake is on the East Side, Highland Park, these very trendy neighborhoods with lots of gorgeous people, and you'll see celebrities there too. But it is very different from the West Side. And
Sure.
one of the things that's different is that on the East Side it is very much an extension of Mexico, in
Yeah.
a way that the West Side is not.
San
The
Gabriel Valley.
like and like on the West Side, yeah, the gardeners and the restaurant workers are all immigrants, just like they are in Chicago and New York. But on the East Side, the homeowners, right? It's like people who have been there for generations, who have
Yeah.
working class but have some capital saved up. They own a small home they bought in the 70s or whatever. That is very much like, you're like, oh, this is cultural. The cultural ecosystem here is part of Mexico, and then you
Yeah.
have all like Yankees who moved in, these Anglos who moved in, but it
Yeah, so,
feels like the base
so
level is Mexico.
yeah, so now that we're speaking of like LA, so Gascon, like the DA there, he's kind of like he was in LA, he was in San Francisco actually, and then he moved to LA. It's like whatever, like musical chairs. You got Pamela Price. They're coming up. There's elections coming up, and do you think they will be voted out? Like, is that what it's looking like? What do you think?
I think definitely. Well, I can't say definitely, but I think very likely yes with Pamela Price. Gascon, I have not paid enough attention to know to have a good sense. My inclination is probably it'll be successful there too, but LA is obviously a much bigger city and a different beast. But it feels I can't say inevitable, but it just feels like the momentum is behind Pamela Price being recalled. I mean, nobody is happy with this person except for like the most ideologically committed activists. And when people voted for her, they didn't really know what they were voting for. And I'm not saying she didn't campaign on it; she very much did. She wasn't like didn't deceive anybody, but it was just like a DA election. People just weren't paying that much attention. She had a lot of lawn signs up. Like I was paying attention to the election. I wasn't really paying attention to the DA's race, and then she won, and I was like, "Who is this person?" I think a lot of informed voters didn't really make an informed choice in that election, and now like things have gone crazy, and they're probably going to vote her out. And now there's a question of whether the mayor is going to be recalled too.
I mean, the mayor sounds pretty ineffectual, but like, what is that? What is the causus bellis there? Like, why?
Well, she's young. She's not to say that being young necessarily means incompetent, but in her case, it does. She's just a young careerist, kind of activist-y hack. She just doesn't seem like a serious person to me at all. You just see her, like, there's the videos of her doing these like endorsement interviews that are just like unbelievable. Like how ignorant she is, and how almost like incurious, and doesn't even care about having no command of these issues. Just not a serious person at all. And not only has Oakland gone to hell on her watch around crime and disorder, but like we're about to lose our last professional sports team. Like it's like we had three professional sports teams with legendary histories: the Raiders, the A's, and the Warriors. And now we're losing the A's, and there's going to be zero professional sports teams in Oakland. Now, a city of 400 and something thousand in a metropolitan area, it's not like unheard of that you wouldn't have any professional sports teams. But this is just a city that has always been built on that spirit. It's always had this massively devoted fan base. It's created these legendary teams. It just feels pathetic. It's like, are we just going to now become like a less desirable bedroom community for San Francisco? It's just like, what is the future of Oakland? It doesn't feel like it feels like its soul has been kind of hollowed out. And now we just have like disorder and incompetent city administration and potholes that never get filled.
Well, I mean, that's a downer, but it sounds like there is change coming though. Are you how you feel about the turnaround potentially? I mean, it seems like the judges are going to be a major issue that are going to need to be addressed, but it seems like the energy. A lot of this is the energy around 2020 that pushed a lot of people in liberal areas because they're like, hey, blah blah blah, whatever, and it seems like that's exhausted. Um, you know, as we're recording this and some people will listen to this in the future, but I mean, it's looking like Trump is probably going to be elected. And a lot of this just seems to be that the Democratic Party, there's a gerontocracy. There was a lot of complacency, it seems. And, they thought the people were with them, but, there's inflation, the housing costs, like all these other issues. And, you have people like Price and Gascon that are like, kind of stuck in the teens in terms of the concerns. They're a little out of step.
I think so. 2020 was crazy, and I'm looking forward to many like interesting books being written about what the hell happened that summer, in particular. I think the left at that point was very much a reflection of, and still is a reflection of, the ascendant, college-educated, professional managerial class that had kind of taken over the left, and it had taken over all the foundations, the Tides Foundation, et cetera, that fund the left. They're all the grant officers of the Ford Foundation, the heads of the nonprofits and whatnot, and the activists. And it led the left astray. And now things haven't changed radically. I'm not suggesting that was like history and now we're in a different moment. But I do think that there's, like, for example, in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, which is like where the open air drug market is concentrated, the fact that the left champions not arresting drug dealers and embraces this absolute just hell zone that the Tenderloin has become is a fundamental betrayal of leftist principles, because the people who live in the Tenderloin, unlike Skid Row in LA, there's actually people who live in the Tenderloin. It's a very densely, I think it is the most densely populated neighborhood in San Francisco with the most kids. And those families are almost entirely immigrants. It was traditionally Vietnamese, I think Cambodian, now a lot of Yemeni families, as well as Central American families. These are poor people with kids who are just struggling to survive, working people, and their kids have to walk by this absolute, just like this, like who's the artist who does the image of hell, the
Which is
really
Dante. Was it Dante's Inferno or?
Hieronymus Bosch, the painter.
Okay, Bosch. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's freaky. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's like
Yeah.
walking through a Bosch painting. The kids have been attacked by addicts on the streets. This 12-year-old Yemeni girl was like beamed in the head by some addict on the street, and then 2 weeks later, she was like out. The girl was seeing her again on the street because she, of course, didn't do any time, was out, and it's like these are the victims of these policies, and so I'm looking forward to the left hopefully becoming realigned at some point with the working class constituencies that it traditionally was supposed to represent. And you would see a far different movement than the one we saw in 2020. I don't know if that'll happen. I hope it does.
Well, one thing, we've been talking for a while, and I'll let you go soon, but as you're talking, I know you come out of the labor left, and I feel, one of the things, as you're talking, I was thinking, the issue with the labor left is, those people kind of came out of those communities, lived in those communities. They had real skin in the game for the outcomes of the policies that they were promoting. Very results-oriented people, right? Like, economic justice, all that stuff. The NGO industrial class is, that's it, for them. A lot of their policies are kind of abstract, aside from, okay, they can get more grant money because there's more. I mean, I'm not going to say that they want more people doing drugs, but if the people doing drugs are not there anymore, what does their NGO do?
Right. They don't want more people doing drugs, but they don't not want more people doing drugs. There's a certain, I wrote a piece about this, about comparing activists like this to like pastors. So there's, again, I'm going to get a little nerdy, but like, Max Weber's sort of distinction in his religious sociology, but he made these distinctions between like, the prophet and the priest and the pastor. the priest is kind of secluded and devoted to esoteric knowledge and is kind of the keeper of esoteric knowledge. The pastor is the person who tends to the flock, and they like do hands-on pastoral care, everyday maintenance of the congregation, which the priest doesn't have to deal with. Um, the activists in my mind are like the pastor insofar as they're like, they have this selfless attitude, right? They're like, their rewards are not monetary, and nor are they status oriented. Well, in a certain sense, they're status oriented, but not in the traditional sense. It's much more this spiritual fulfillment that they get, the psychic benefits of feeling like you're a better like you're an enlightened, better person, and the kind of status awards that come with that. But and so like the pastor has to attend to the flock to save their souls. What if the flock disappeared? What if the congregation disappeared? The pastor would just no longer exist. So it's like there's a symbiotic relationship. The congregation needs the pastor to have their soul saved, and the pastor needs the congregation in order to have their purpose fulfilled as a pastor. These activists, I think, are in the same circumstance where it's like, yeah, they do want the best for these like drug addicts on the street. It's not like they're not like, we're going to farm these drug addicts for our own benefit. It's not that cynical. It's not like Dr. Evil kind of shit, but it's like, but it is like, you don't have a role. You don't have your whole purpose in life is completely absent without the existence of a population of immiserated, chemically enslaved, shadows of their former selves, this population of just absolute zombies. You need them for your to derive your purpose in life, and to that extent you are dependent upon perpetuating them as a population, and that is very much happening in San Francisco. I think that dynamic is very much at work, as cynical as that sounds.
Yeah, it's interesting you're talking about NGOs. It reminds me of some of the critique of contractors in the, during the Iraq War period, where basically, the critique was soldiers are they're under much more control and they commit fewer atrocities. Like soldiers, like American soldiers fighting for the American government, as opposed to contractors who are fighting for the American government. And, this development of NGOs, I think some people have argued it's partly due to, conservative, ideas that non-governmental, like people, the government can't do anything.
Yeah.
And so you just farm it out to these private agencies, these nonprofits, and then it kind of created a monster.
Yeah, it's neoliberalism. I mean, this is also why it's just such a joke that sort of these nonprofit workers and leaders posture themselves as these like edgelord political radicals, because I'm like, I used to work in the labor movement. I worked for SEIU, and I was working in the private sector healthcare field, but SEIU represents a ton of public sector workers, of course, and including city workers in San Francisco. And every contract battle was about outsourcing these jobs to nonprofits. And eventually SEIU started organizing these nonprofits, these like, much lower wage nonprofits, because they were like, this is just a union busting strategy that you're using. And so now we need to organize these people to bring them up to level. And so like, that's where that whole kind of tier comes from, is just this austerity kind of approach to governance. And so like, I'm like, this is just a privatized workforce this is just a privatized government, but yet they now have lobbying powers. So now they usurp the voters in terms of being able to guide policy in these cities, because they have the ears of the leaders and they have resources and they're in the mix in a way that voters aren't.
Yeah. I mean, we need to end this. I mean, I think we hit the main things. I will say, it's a weird position for those of us who are not on to the left of center or not Democrats, because the worse California gets, the more people move to Texas and Florida. Mm-hmm. And, here in Texas, here in Austin, as there's a crisis of declining rents.
Right.
I'm just laughing because, like, you live in California. I don't really think that you know what that even looks like. Like, you could imagine.
I've never heard of such a thing.
And I know that there's a lot of liberal critiques of Texas and Florida that you can make. The abortion issues obviously is a big deal. And our public services. I mean, you can tell we don't invest as much in that. Although I have to say, I went to New York State recently, and for the tax rates that they have, they do not invest in their roads the way they should. But anyway, setting that aside, so from a Republican, conservative, whatever, like that part, it's actually not all bad that the liberal areas are going to hell in a handbasket. But as an American, it is bad, right? So it's like I think people like have like sometimes they have a little bit of mixed feelings because, as you said, they're like, well, these people voted for it, they're just like good riddance and blah blah blah. But on the other hand, there's half of our population lives in these areas, or more than half probably because they're big urban areas, and human well-being is all of our interests.
It's stupid for Republicans to discard these urban areas as it is for Democrats to act as if the hinterland, like the rural areas of America don't matter. It's like, first of all, like even though this is very much a West Coast phenomenon, as you and I discussed, I think before we were recording, now like the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia looks exactly the same as the Tenderloin. It's like it's not just the West Coast. This is happening in all our cities now. It starts here and it moves east. And like if you're of the notion that it doesn't matter what happens to your cities in your country, you're crazy, dude. Like It's like the tide of humanity has been one of moving from rural areas towards urban areas, of urbanization. This matters more than anything. I would say, even though I'm not one of those people to dismiss what happens in rural areas, first of all, because human beings live there and we should care what happens to human beings, but also they are a huge part of the economy. But I would argue that it matters more what happens in the city than the countryside, just for your national character and for your national destiny. So this is an American.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing I'll say about California, I was like talking to a friend of mine who's conservative, lives in LA though. One problem in California is the Republicans at the state level, they seem to be LARPers, like live action role playing. Like they're very conservative. They're so conservative that they never have a chance to really compete in the state. And like we were talking about New England earlier. New England still has a moderate Republican presence. Republican governors are still elected in Massachusetts. And that's because the Republicans understand they're in a liberal, Democratic dominated area and they have to reposition. But the reason the Republican governors are elected in Massachusetts is the people know that they need a check on, frankly, a party that tends towards corruption when it's in power, uniformly too long. And I think that's what's happened to the Democrats in California, but they don't have a check on them because the Republicans in California are these hardcore conservative hyper libertarians that think that it's still 1982. And it's
although Schwarzenegger was a Republican governor, although
he was a moderate.
Yeah, he was basically a Democrat.
Yeah, he was a conservative Democrat, moderate. He was in the center. So basically, in California, just the way it works, the numbers work is if you're a Republican, you got to be a centrist. And if they had a pro-choice, whatever. I mean, abortion. I mean, it's going to be legal in California no matter what, right? So it doesn't really honestly matter. So all of these like symbolic cultural issues, it's just like dragging them down. What you need is competence. What you need is an option of a party that can give you competence. And then when you have some competition, obviously, the other party will also react in kind. But when people think that they have free reign, that's a problem, it seems like, in these democratic systems.
I mean, I know we're trying to wrap up, but just a quick observation, which is like, in California, the moderate Republicans could be affluent, like historically tended to be affluent suburban Californians in places like Orange County or Ventura County, for example. Those those folks are now all Democrats, right? They're just because of this great realignment, like
negative polarization.
Right. So now with the Republicans that you have in California, to bring it back again to the Woodard thesis, are of a different nation in a Woodard sense. That like you've got
Bakersfield.
They're in the far west nation, and so in the legislature you've got the minority Republicans who represent the majority of the state geographically, but by far the minority population wise because of the Bay Area and LA, basically in San Diego and Santa Barbara, because of the left coast. They are of a totally different, like in a rational system, they would be in a different state altogether.
Yes. Yes. Yes, they would. I mean, I'm from Eastern Oregon. I grew up in Eastern Oregon, and it's definitely it's definitely a big difference once you go east of the Cascades to west of the Cascades. Idaho feels much more similar to where I grew up than the Willamette Valley or Portland. And California's the same. I lived in California for a decade. Went to grad school at Davis, so Davis is not quite like the hardcore Central Valley, but it's on the edge. You start to see it, and
Yeah.
it's a whole different world from just like an hour to the west in the Bay. And it's a great state. It's a diverse state. The weather's great. I mean, there's a reason 40 million people live in California. There's a reason there's so much innovation in California. There's a lot of great things about the state, and that's why a lot of us. I mean, yeah, some people have Schadenfreude and whatever, but like a lot of us, we want the state to succeed because if California succeeds, America succeeds. Fundamentally, just the truth. Like it is the innovation driver of our country. Yeah, there's like some secondary loci in like Boston and other areas, but it's San Francisco, it's California. LA has the aerospace. We cannot let this state go to hell in a handbasket because then America itself will be the same.
Exactly, 1,000%.
All right, so we've been talking for a while. It was a great conversation. I just want to remind people, social studies, Leighton Woodhouse, .substack.com. Hey, are you going to get your own domain, bro?
I had my own domain. It was just LeightonWoodhouse.com, and stupidly I let it lapse because I didn't think I was going to use it anymore. And now some, like, I don't know, some Malaysian person, person owns
it. Ian Michael Chong. Oh my God, Ian Michael. Like you get on a Zoom call with Ian Michael Chong, and he's like, "Hey, if you could get me a green card so I can finally visit the United States, I will give you the domain back." No, but see, you're gonna be focusing on your Substack again. That's great. Like what kind of things are you interested in? You're talking about the judges. Like what kind of reporting are you doing?
Well, I'm going to be doing more about the beat that I've been on, which is the addiction crisis, homelessness, crime, and disorder. So I'll focus on that, and then as you mentioned before, I'm a filmmaker too, so I do a lot of video, which I plan to do more of, and I'm excited. So Lee Fang is a mutual friend of ours, and Lee and I will probably be doing some work together, which I'm excited about. And then doing more work for the Free Press.
Awesome. Excited. Great conversation. I hope people enjoyed all the different topics we went on. I kind of wanted to talk about the crime, and we did talk about the crime, and then we're talking about like Albion C is like awesome, man. So this is how it goes, right? All right.
Totally.
You have a good day, man.
All right, you too. Bye.
This podcast for kids